buried in an avalanche. The mountain air was crisp, the snow beneath Jack's boots crunching softly as he made his way up the ridge. The world was peaceful, too peaceful. He had always loved climbing. The thrill, the solitude, the way the world seemed to stretch endlessly beneath him. But the silence today was unnerving. Even the wind had died down. Then, a distant rumble. Jack froze. His heartbeat hammered in his chest. The sound grew louder, rolling like thunder. He turned just in time to see it. The mountain had come alive. A wall of snow, massive, unstoppable, was crashing toward him. "Run!" his brain screamed. But where? He turned, his boots slipping on the ice, his legs pumping as fast as they could. His breath came in ragged gasps, the altitude making his lungs burn. Then, impact. The avalanche hit him like a freight train. The force threw him forward, flipping him violently through the churning snow. It wasn't soft. It was like being caught in a river of concrete, ice, and stone. His body slammed against unseen obstacles. His legs snapped, his ribs cracked, and then he stopped. Everything went still. Jack's entire world was darkness. He tried to move, but he couldn't. The snow had set like cement around him. His arms were pinned, his legs useless. He was trapped. He tried to breathe, but there was no air. Every exhale made the snow around his mouth tighten, closing in. His chest strained, his lungs screaming for oxygen. Panic gripped him. Which way was up? Where was the surface? His mind raced. He had to stay calm. If he hyperventilated, he would die faster. But it was so cold. His fingers had already gone numb. His body was shutting down. His lungs burned. His head spun. His heart pounded, then slowed. His thoughts became hazy. The snow was his grave. His eyes fluttered shut, his body surrendering to the cold embrace of the mountain. And then, silence. Boiled alive. Steam rose in thick clouds, twisting through the damp air, filling the room with the suffocating scent of scalding water. The pipes groaned under pressure, vibrating like an ominous warning. Mark wiped sweat from his brow, blinking against the intense heat. He had worked at the industrial processing plant for years, maintaining the massive boilers that powered the facility. But tonight, something was wrong. A sharp hiss cut through the air. He turned toward the main pressure gauge and felt his stomach drop. The needle was in the red. He barely had time to react before, boom. The safety valve burst. A geyser of scalding hot water and steam erupted, blasting the room with a searing force. Mark screamed. The boiling water hit him full force, instantly searing his skin. His arms, his chest, every inch of exposed flesh blistered on contact. He staggered backward, his body convulsing in pain. His nerves were on fire, literally. He could barely think, barely move as the heat ate through him. His flesh peeled away in sheets, falling to the floor in steaming patches. His skin, his muscles, all melting. He gasped for air, but his lungs inhaled pure steam. The heat burned him from the inside. His throat swelled instantly, closing his airway. He couldn't breathe. His legs buckled. He fell to his knees, his hands pressing against the wet metal floor, only to sizzle like meat on a grill. His fingernails peeled away. His blood boiled beneath his skin. His veins ruptured, bursting from the relentless heat. He tried to scream, but his vocal cords had been burned away. His body convulsed violently, muscles twitching, shutting down. The pain was beyond agony, beyond anything the human body should be able to endure. He collapsed, his body steaming, his skin slipping from his bones. And then, finally, his heart stopped. The boiler had taken him, and all that remained was a melted corpse in a pool of scalding water, torn apart by a tornado. The wind howled like a beast, rattling the windows and bending trees until they nearly snapped. Dark clouds churned overhead, thick and menacing as lightning cracked across the sky. Noah gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. This storm wasn't normal. It had come out of nowhere, swelling into something monstrous in minutes. The sirens screamed. A tornado was coming. His truck skidded on the rain-slicked road as he pushed the gas, his heart pounding. He had to get out of here. But then, in his rearview mirror, it appeared. A massive funnel of rotating wind, stretching from the sky to the ground, ripping apart everything in its path. It moved with terrifying speed, devouring houses, trees, cars, and it was coming for him. Noah swerved off the road, tires spraying mud as he leaped out of the truck. There was nowhere to go. The land was flat, open, nowhere to hide. The wind hit him like a punch to the chest, nearly knocking him off his feet. He dropped to the ground, digging his fingers into the wet grass, trying to anchor himself. But it didn't matter. The air shifted. Gravity felt strange. Wrong. Then, his feet left the ground. A sudden, powerful force yanked him upward. Noah screamed as he was pulled into the swirling chaos, his body flailing helplessly. The tornado spun him like a rag doll, twisting him through the air. Rain slashed at his skin like needles. Debris. Glass, wood, metal. Whipped around him at terrifying speeds. Something sharp struck his leg. He felt the sickening snap of bone breaking. His arms flailed, reaching for something. Anything. But there was nothing to grab, only air, only wind. The world spun, a blur of black clouds and flying wreckage. A chunk of roofing slammed into his side, crushing his ribs. The pain was instant, blinding, but he had no time to scream. Another object, a jagged piece of metal, tore through his stomach. Noah gasped, his body shaking violently. Blood poured from the wound, but the wind carried it away before it could even soak his clothes. His vision darkened, his body went limp. The tornado held him for a few more seconds, then flung him like trash, hurling him toward the earth at deadly speed. The last thing he saw was the ground rushing toward him. Then, impact. And nothing. Buried alive. James gasped as he jolted awake. His chest heaved, lungs desperate for air, but something was wrong. He couldn't move his arms. His legs were trapped. He reached out, but his fingers scraped against something solid. Wood. Rough and splintered. His heart pounded as he pushed upward. The surface didn't budge. Panic seized his body. "Hello?" Someone. "Help." His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. No response. His breathing quickened, hot and shallow. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dirt and decay. He pressed his palms against the surface above him and pushed with all his strength. Nothing. The weight of the earth above held it firmly in place. Then it hit him. He was buried alive. His mind raced, trying to piece together the last thing he remembered. A party, too many drinks, walking home alone, and then nothing. A blackout. His stomach churned. Had someone done this to him? He slammed his fists against the wood, screaming, thrashing, kicking. The coffin walls absorbed the sound, dulling his cries into muffled whispers. No one would hear him. His breathing turned erratic. Every inhale felt thinner than the last. He needed to stay calm. Panicking would only use up the little air he had left. He ran his hands along the coffin's lid, feeling for any weaknesses. His fingers trembled. Then a crack. A small break in the wood. Hope surged through him. He dug his nails into it, forcing the crack wider. His fingers scraped against dirt. Loose, dry dirt. If he could break through, he might have a chance. He clawed, ignoring the pain, splinters embedding in his skin. He forced his fingers into the gap, shoving dirt aside, trying to dig upward. The soil poured in, covering his hands, then his wrists. He kept going, inch by inch. Then, the dirt collapsed. It poured in too fast, too heavy. His arms were swallowed, his chest, his face. He gasped, but inhaled dirt instead of air. He coughed, choking, but the soil kept coming. It filled his mouth, his nose. He tried to spit it out, to scream, but more dirt rushed in, blocking his throat. His body convulsed, starved of oxygen. His lungs burned, desperate for air. His arms flailed, but the earth held him tight, crushing, suffocating. His mind reeled, flashes of his life playing behind his eyes. His mother's face, his childhood home, his first love, the feeling of sunlight on his skin, and now, only darkness. His heartbeat slowed, his limbs twitched. His body gave up, sinking into stillness. The last thing he felt was the cold, crushing embrace of the earth, dragging him down into nothingness. Then, silence. Drowning. The waves crashed violently against the boat. The sky, once a peaceful blue, had turned into an ominous shade of black. Thunder rumbled in the distance, and rain poured from the heavens like an unrelenting curse. Ethan gripped the edge of the small fishing boat, his knuckles white. The storm had come out of nowhere, turning the once calm sea into a nightmare of roaring water and howling wind. "Hold on," his friend Jake shouted, but his voice was barely audible over the chaos. Then it happened. A massive wave. It rose out of the darkness like a towering wall, and before Ethan could react, it crashed down onto them. The force was like being slammed by a truck. The boat flipped. Ethan was thrown into the abyss, cold. That was the first thing he felt. An unbearable, bone-chilling cold that wrapped around his body and squeezed the air from his lungs. He tumbled in the blackness, disoriented, unable to tell which way was up. He opened his mouth to scream, but only salt water rushed in. His chest burned as he fought to expel it, but the ocean was unforgiving. The waves tossed him like a rag doll, dragging him deeper and deeper. He flailed, kicking, trying to swim. But which way? His limbs were numb, his lungs screaming for air. He needed to reach the surface, but the water was too dark, too vast. Panic took over. His arms clawed at the emptiness, legs kicking violently. His head spun, his ears filled with the muffled roar of the ocean. Then, a glimmer, a faint silver light above. The surface. Hope surged through him. He kicked harder, his body desperate for oxygen. The pressure in his chest was unbearable, his lungs convulsing, demanding air. Almost there. His fingertips broke through the surface. He opened his mouth, ready to gasp. Another wave crashed over him. He was sucked back under. The last breath he had left escaped in a rush of bubbles. His vision blurred. His body felt heavy, sluggish. He reached out toward the fading light above, but his limbs wouldn't obey him. The world around him grew quiet. The desperation, the panic, it all faded. The cold became comfortable. The darkness, welcoming. His mind drifted. Memories flickered. His childhood laughter, his mother's voice, the warmth of the sun on his face. And then, nothing. The ocean had claimed him. Burned alive. The smell of smoke was the first thing Ava noticed. It was faint at first, just a whisper in the air, something her tired mind barely registered. But then it grew thicker, heavier, creeping into her lungs, forcing her awake. She sat up in bed, blinking through the dimness of her apartment. Something was wrong. Then she saw it. Under her door, a thin line of orange glow. Fire. Panic gripped her chest as she scrambled out of bed, rushing to the door. But the moment her fingers touched the handle, searing pain. She yanked her hand back, biting down a scream. The metal was burning hot. The fire was already here. Her breathing became frantic. The air was thick with smoke, curling into the room like a living thing. It burned her throat, made her eyes water. She coughed, covering her mouth with her sleeve. but it didn't help. She ran to the window, 4 stories up. Too high to jump. Ava turned back toward the door, but suddenly, boom! The door exploded inward, engulfed in a wall of flames. The fire roared like a monster, licking up the walls, swallowing everything in its path. The heat was unbearable, pressing against her skin like the breath of something evil. Her lungs begged for air, but all she inhaled was smoke. Her body convulsed in violent coughs, each one more desperate than the last. She had to get out. Now she darted toward the bathroom, but the fire moved faster. It spread like a wave, racing up the ceiling, crawling toward her. The heat grew unbearable. Her skin prickled, then blistered. She screamed as the flames licked at her feet, the pain unlike anything she had ever known. She ran. She tried to find a way out, but the fire was everywhere. The walls, the furniture, the floor, all consumed. Her legs buckled. She collapsed, her body shaking, her vision blurring. Her skin burned, blistered, peeled. Every nerve in her body screamed in agony. Her hands trembled as she tried to push herself up, but she was too weak. Her lungs filled with smoke. She coughed once, twice, then nothing. She felt herself slipping, the pain slowly fading. The fire still raged, but it didn't matter anymore. The last thing she saw was the glow of the flames, bright as the sun, consuming everything she was. Then, darkness. Eaten alive. The jungle was alive with sound, the hum of insects, the distant calls of unseen creatures, the rustling of leaves in the thick, humid air. David wiped the sweat from his brow as he pushed forward, his boots sinking into the damp soil. His map was useless now, smudged with mud and torn at the edges. He had been lost for hours, maybe days, but he wasn't alone. Something was watching him. At first it was just a feeling, a slight unease creeping up his spine, the way the hairs on his arms stood on end. Then he heard it. A low growl. David froze, his breath hitched. Slowly he turned his head. In the dense foliage, 2 glowing eyes stared back at him. A shadow moved, massive, predatory, a jaguar. His heart slammed against his ribs. He knew better than to run. Running would make him prey. But his body betrayed him. His feet moved before he could think. He sprinted, crashing through the jungle, dodging vines and roots, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind him a snarl. Then a blur of muscle and claws. The impact hit like a truck, knocking him face first into the dirt. His skull rattled, his vision swam. A heavy weight pressed against his back. Then pain, teeth. Sharp, massive fangs sank into his shoulder. He screamed as the jaguar ripped flesh from bone. His body convulsed in agony. He tried to fight, but the beast was too strong. It growled, dragging him into the undergrowth. He clawed at the dirt, his nails breaking, his mind screaming for escape. But the jaguar had already claimed him. It clamped its jaws around his leg. Bones snapped. David's screams turned hoarse, his throat raw. His body twitched involuntarily as the jaguar dug its claws into his stomach, its teeth tearing through muscle. Warm blood pooled beneath him, soaking the earth. His head swam, his vision darkening. He felt his body go limp. He knew somewhere deep inside that this was the end. The jungle around him blurred. The last thing he heard was the sound of his own flesh being torn apart. Then, nothing. Falling from extreme heights. The city lights sparkled below, a vast grid of neon and headlights stretching to the horizon. Ethan stood at the edge of the rooftop, his breath steady, his pulse hammering in his ears. The wind howled around him, tugging at his jacket, whispering against his skin like ghostly fingers. One misstep, and he would be gone. He wasn't supposed to be here. It was supposed to be a simple job: climb to the top, take the photos, get out. Urban explorers did it all the time. The abandoned high-rise had been his latest conquest, a challenge to prove himself. But now he was trapped. It happened so fast. One step too far, a piece of rusted metal snapping underfoot, the sudden, heart-stopping loss of balance. For a split second, time froze. Then, he fell. The rooftop vanished above him. The ground, so far below, rushed toward him in a blur of color and light. The air roared past his ears, deafening, drowning out his own scream. His stomach lurched. The sensation of weightlessness was pure horror, a sickening pull in his gut as gravity took hold. He flailed, his arms reaching for something. Anything to grab onto. But there was nothing, just open space, the cold wind tearing at his body. Panic consumed him. The city below grew sharper, the streets stretching out like a deadly net of concrete and steel. People moved like ants, unaware of the man plummeting toward them. His brain refused to accept it. This couldn't be real. There had to be a way out, some miracle, something to stop him. But there wasn't. His body turned mid-air, twisting as he fell. The rush of air stole his breath, his heartbeat racing faster than his thoughts. The ground was so close now. Seconds felt like eternity. The last thing he saw was his own shadow stretching out beneath him. Then, impact. The world went black. Radiation poisoning. Liam sat on the cracked concrete floor, staring at his trembling hands. His fingers, once strong and steady, now shook uncontrollably. His skin, once smooth, had turned a sickly shade of red, raw, peeling, covered in sores. He didn't know how much time had passed since the accident. Days? Weeks? His memory was slipping. His thoughts felt scattered, sluggish, like his brain was drowning in fog. It had started with a bright flash, a burst of white light that flooded the power plant in an instant. Then a pressure wave, a sound like the very air had been torn apart. Liam had been on duty that night. He remembered the alarms screaming, the frantic shouting of his co-workers, the metallic taste in his mouth. He had tried to run, but something inside him had felt wrong, heavy, burning. Now he was dying, and it was the worst kind of death. He coughed, the motion sending a sharp pain deep into his bones. He looked down at his sleeve. It was stained red. Blood. His lungs were failing. At first it had just been nausea, a mild headache. He had convinced himself it was stress, just exhaustion. But then his skin had started to burn. His hair had begun to fall out in clumps. His gums bled when he brushed his teeth. Now his entire body felt like it was rotting from the inside. His stomach clenched, and a wave of unbearable pain tore through him. He doubled over, his insides twisting, convulsing. He felt like he was being ripped apart cell by cell. Radiation was destroying him. His DNA was breaking down. His organs were shutting down one by one. His body was trying to fight, but there was no fight to be won. He groaned, collapsing onto his side. His muscles spasmed violently. The pain was unlike anything he had ever known. Not a sharp stab, not something that came and went, but a deep, ceaseless agony. His vision blurred. His mind drifted. Somewhere in the distance he could hear voices, people rushing toward him. Maybe they were doctors. Maybe they thought they could save him. But Liam knew better. He was already dead. The last thing he felt was the heat of his own blood pooling beneath him. Then, nothing. Trapped in space. The stars stretched endlessly in all directions, silent, beautiful, and deadly. Daniel's breathing was shallow and slow, the only sound in his helmet a rhythmic hiss of oxygen. His hands trembled as he checked the small screen on his suit. Oxygen remaining, 5%. He was going to die out here. The mission had gone wrong in a matter of seconds. One miscalculation. One mistake. He had been outside the spacecraft, performing a routine repair when the collision happened. A stray piece of debris, no bigger than a fist, struck him hard. The force had ripped him away from the station, sending him drifting. He had screamed, called for help, but there was no answer. The radio was dead. The ship was growing smaller, disappearing into the black abyss. And now he was alone, drifting, falling, though there was nothing to fall toward. His suit was intact, but oxygen was running out. He stared at the vast emptiness around him. The stars twinkled like distant diamonds, so close yet so impossibly far. The earth, the only home he had ever known, loomed in the distance. He had never felt so small. He tried to move, to turn himself toward the station, but his thruster pack was damaged. He was spinning now, slowly, endlessly, his body twisting in the vast nothingness. His breathing quickened. Oxygen remaining. 2% panic clawed at his chest. He tried to fight it, to stay calm, but his body knew. He was suffocating. His limbs felt heavy, his lungs burned, each breath harder than the last. His vision blurred, his heartbeat slowed, his mind drifted. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. The fear faded. The cold wrapped around him like a blanket. The universe stretched before him, endless and quiet. Crushed to death. The tunnels stretched deep beneath the earth, winding like the veins of some ancient beast. The only light came from Carter's helmet lamp, casting eerie shadows along the damp rock walls. He was a spelunker, an explorer of the underground world, fascinated by the hidden caverns that existed beneath the surface. But now he was trapped. The cave had seemed safe at first, until it wasn't. A single wrong turn had led him into a narrow crawl space, barely wide enough for his shoulders. He had tried to turn back, but the rock had shifted. A sudden collapse. The ceiling had pressed down with an ear-splitting crack, and now his body was pinned. He couldn't move his arms. He couldn't even take a full breath. His ribs pressed against unyielding stone. Each inhale was shallower than the last. He exhaled, feeling the walls tighten even more. The weight was unbearable. His chest ached. He struggled, tried to shift even an inch, but nothing budged. His legs were wedged beneath him, useless. His fingers scraped at the rock, nails breaking, bleeding. He screamed, but the sound barely traveled. The cave swallowed his voice. Above him, more stones crumbled. A fine layer of dust rained down, coating his lips, filling his nostrils. The air felt thinner, heavier. The cave was still shifting, and soon it would crush him completely. His mind raced. Was there a way out? Was anyone coming? Had anyone even noticed he was missing? A dull pain spread through his torso, a pressure like a giant hand squeezing his lungs. His breathing became shorter, shallower, his ribs strained. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, faster and faster. He knew what was coming. His vision blurred. His body trembled. The stone pressed harder, compressing his organs, crushing the life from him. His last breath came as a whisper. The cave claimed him. And then, darkness.